In terms of the plea agreement, as an attorney, how do you determine whether or not a client should accept a plea deal?
Well, every situation is unique. An analysis, ultimately the decision is made by the client, but you go through an analysis with the client. You analyze the strength of the case against the client, juxtapose that with the strength of the client's defense. Not only that, you have to analyze what kind of offer, if any, has been made. You take that offer and you consider, is that an offer the client can live with based upon what he may or may not have done, his station in life. Is he 21 years old facing 20 years, or is he 71 years old facing 20 years? It makes a difference where you are in life and ultimately what you can handle, and can you go through the fire. Can you go through the fire? Going to trial is like going through the fire. After weighing all of these factors, the client's individual status, his age, what he's able to handle, the plea, is it a plea he can live with, the strength of the case against him, the strength of our defense, ultimately you make a decision tailored specifically to that particular client in that particular situation. No two situations are alike. What you do with one client in one case, the next client might have a completely different approach. But you take all that into consideration, you advise the client as to what you think is best, and then you allow him to make a decision. My job, I've always felt, as I was taught, is not to tell the client what to do, but to lay all of his options, pros and cons, so that he makes an informed decision. I advise him, but ultimately it's up to him.
I would imagine it's agonizing.
It is a tough decision, especially when you're dealing in the criminal law, when you're dealing with people's lives, and ultimately you're dealing with freedom. Whether you're dealing with a civil ordinance violation, which might carry 90 days, you're dealing with a capital case, which is automatic life. It's always agonizing. You're talking about the deprivation of one's freedom. So it's a decision that's got to be taken seriously, and you go through the same analysis with every client. What is your position? What is the offer? Ultimately, what can you live with, and what do you want to do? I'll advise you on the legal end. You know your personal situation. Together, we make an analysis, we make a decision. Whatever that decision is, we'll fight for you.
And how is Derek doing after accepting this plea agreement, knowing, what he faces now?
Well, anytime someone takes a plea, it's hard. But Derek is doing the best he can under the circumstances. Everybody knows the dynamics of this case, and that a lot of the people involved, not just the co-defendants, but other folks who have cooperated along the way, they worked together, they knew each other. So it's a tough decision, but every one of the defendants, I assume, has made a decision that they felt was best for their individual circumstance. Derek has done the same thing. He's acknowledged that he has made some mistakes. It's well known that Derek Miller was one of the top city officials in terms of honesty and integrity in dealing with the community. There's hardly a bad word that's said about him. But he's acknowledged that he has made some mistakes. He's owned up to those mistakes by the plea, and he's moving forward.
And what do you think, what's your best guesstimate as to, whether or not he'll receive the minimum or the maximum in terms of prison time as well as the fine?
Well, what we're talking about are numbers. Those numbers, the sentencing numbers, are ultimately determined by the judge, Judge Nancy Edmonds. The U.S. Attorney's Office and I have a disagreement as to what those numbers are, and that disagreement has been acknowledged. Ultimately, the judge is going to have to decide who is correct. We believe his numbers are between 41 months and 51 months. That's based upon our calculation of what he's pled to. The government has a different calculation, but I understand their rationale. They understand my rationale. We're going to fight for what we believe to be the correct number, and they're going to do the same.
And so you will have to argue that before the judge?
At sentencing, we will argue the numbers, how we feel the numbers should be calculated, and how the government knows our position. We know their position. That's been acknowledged, and the court will ultimately rule.
Wouldn't that be clear? The numbers, wouldn't they actually be clear?
Well, it's not uncommon to have discrepancies as to how the there's a formula that goes into calculating the guidelines. The numbers have to be plugged in. I don't want to get into the specifics of this particular case, but there's a discrepancy on some of the value of the numbers that are plugged in. The amount of the numbers helps to determine what the guidelines are, and we have a discrepancy on some of the numbers.
And there's no date for sentencing at this point?
No, the court has not set one. Ultimately, that's up to the judge.
And the new revelations that came out, just in looking at the plea agreement, it talks about Derek and his company receiving $568,000 dealing with Mr. Shoemake. Can you comment on anything related to those allegations?
No, I'm not going to comment on the specific plea. We stand by the plea agreement.